Welcome to the Gay Buddhist Forum, where teachers from all schools of Buddhism offer their perspectives on the Dharma and its application in modern times, especially for LGBTQI audiences. These talks are offered freely to the world and made possible by appreciative listeners. If you would like to support our efforts to share the Dharma with underserved audiences, please visit gaybuddhist.org. There you can donate, find a list of upcoming speakers, or enjoy many hundreds of these recorded talks dating back to 1996.
So it is my real pleasure and honor to introduce Charles Garfield. He's the founder of Shanti and the Shanti National Training Institute. He's a founding faculty member at the Metta Institute, End of Life Counseling, program research scholar at the Star King School for the Ministry at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, and a mathematician on the Apollo 11 first lunar landing program. It's pretty cool. Dr. Garfield is a clinical professor of psychology at the Department of Psychiatry at the University of California Medical School and a faculty member at the C.G. Jung Institute in San Francisco. He has published 10 books, including Sometimes My Heart Goes Numb, Love and Caregiving in a Time of AIDS, Psychosocial Care of the Dying Patient, and Stress and Survival, the Emotional Realities of Life-Threatening Illnesses. So, welcome.
Maybe we can start by wishing our friends and neighbors at the Beta Breakers all good fortune as they laugh and sweat and run while we're sitting and exploring the rippling effect of love. And if they were to ask you, well, what did you talk about while I was sweating and laughing and wearing peculiar costumes? You can say, well, he said a lot of things, but the only thing I really remember is he said several times that love heals. The rest are details. Love heals. So let's talk about the rippling effect of love and the ways in which love heals. And to do so not in a theoretical sense, but in an actual sense. It's a wonderful poem by a poet named David White, whose work I recommend. He says, sometimes if you move carefully through the forest, breathing like the ones in the old stories who could cross a shimmering bed of dry leaves without a sound, you come to a place whose only task is to trouble you with tiny but frightening requests, conceived out of nowhere, but in this place beginning to lead everywhere. Requests to stop what you're doing right now, stop what you're becoming while you do it. Questions that can make or unmake a life. Questions that have patiently waited for you. Questions that have no right to go away. Questions that have no right to go away. One question that has no right to go away, it seems to me, is what quality that we all possess is central to the rippling effect of love? What quality that we all possess? It may not be front of mind position, but we all possess it. And that quality is empathy. Empathy. That resonance that allows us to feel our way into the experience, particularly the suffering of other people. But it's not just suffering. Feeling the experience of other people. Allowing us entry into the heart of one another. It's a deeply felt quality, or it can be. It allows us to go beyond just thinking about other people or thinking about people who are struggling. Or perhaps writing a check to support a nonprofit organization, although I certainly have nothing against that. It really is about going more deeply into the experience. It's like tuning forks. You hit one and the other one vibrates. It's a resonance. Empathy, a resonance. Now, another question that has no right to go away is, what suffering in the world calls to you? Calls to you specifically. Calls to you so loudly that the rippling effect of your love becomes common sense. common sense and moves you to action. What expression of suffering is intolerable to you? Intolerable in the sense that you have to do something. It leads to the question, I've got to do something about this. I can't just sit back. I have to do something. I've got a personal example of what's called to me for 42 years now. Same expression of suffering for 42 years. I founded Shanti 42 years ago. I was a kid at the time. I was in my 20s, and I was on the faculty at the Cancer Research Institute at UC San Francisco. Big acute care cancer facility. See if you can ride with me on this journey. I had just graduated from a wonderful doctoral program at UC Berkeley in clinical psychology. I loved the field. It was exactly what I wanted to study. If you remember that time in your life, well, maybe it was the same for you as it was for me. Long on enthusiasm and short on experience. Thought you knew a lot, but didn't. Well, that's who I was. I meant to do well. I wanted to do well. I was the only mental health professional at a large acute care facility. There were 40 beds. There was somebody seriously ill in each of those beds, and nobody was dealing with the mental health issues. Nobody. There was not a single person on that unit. There were good docs and good nurses, but there were no people dealing with the spiritual or psychological issues. And when I talked to the medical director, he said, well, let me tell you how we've defined your job. You're in charge of the psychosocial needs of our patients. I looked down the corridor to 40 people. And he said, oh, by the way, the nurses are under tremendous stress around here. And they're burning out. And could you run some support groups for nurses? And he said, oh, and also, by the way, the interns who come up here, they're freaked out by this cancer institute. So can you meet with them one-on-one as needed to help them? Well, he was defining a job perhaps for 5 or 6 people. He thought I was supposed to be doing it myself, and I had a choice. I had a choice. Either stay, it was exactly the work I wanted to do, except it was defined in this crazy way, or leave. But I was going to leave a job that I really wanted to do. I wanted to use the skills that I had learned at Berkeley in clinical psychology to help people. Sitting in an office as a psychotherapist was not enough for me. And it's a wonderful occupation, and lots of people do it well, and thank God they're there, the good ones. But it wasn't enough. I wanted to see suffering at very basic, raw levels, and to help do something, to help people who are really scared and alone. So I had that choice, and I didn't know what to do. I just didn't know what to do. I knew if I stayed and tried to do the job, I would burn out fast. There was just no way. One day, in the shower, I had an idea. I won't call it an epiphany. That's glorifying it a little too much. But it was an idea that got me excited, put it that way. Volunteers. Volunteers. If I could get you guys to come with me to the Cancer Institute, I would select those of you who really wanted to do the work. I would train you. I would match you with patients one-on-one. And I would supervise so that when you wanted to talk about it, what was going on, somebody would be there. I had no idea whether anybody would take me up on it. But I made a list of 50 people and all sorts of folks, all sorts of friends and relations and former patients, and God knows who else was on my list. And 30 people said they were interested, and 15 people ended up being serious about it, and they were the first Shanti volunteers. One great idea in the shower. And I'll tell you why it was a great idea in a moment if you don't already know. One great idea in the shower. What I wish for all of you is one great idea, wherever you have it, in the shower or wherever. And what I hope you do is you don't talk yourself out of it. We talk ourselves out of our best ideas. I hope you don't talk yourself out of it. Think of what I could have said. The doctors won't let me do it. Bringing regular people up here? You go try talking to your doctor about bringing regular people up into the hospital. The nurses thought they were already doing it. Nobody else was there. No mental health people, no clergy. Nobody. I could have talked myself out of it, but for some reason I didn't. Maybe it was the audacity of youth. If I knew what it was going to take, I probably wouldn't have done it. Maybe. But it worked. It worked. And for 7 years, first at the Cancer Institute at UC, and then in the community, I got so sick and tired of the politics of the university that I took my new project and I put it out into the community. And people sometimes ask, well, how'd you get the name Shanti? It would have been a whole lot easier for fundraising purposes if I had called the project the San Francisco Cancer Support Network or some predictable name like that. Shanti is a Sanskrit word that means inner peace. It translates roughly as inner peace, the kind of inner peace that sometimes happens when people meet in just the right way. If you've ever fallen in love, if you've ever met somebody who you clicked with beautifully, even though you didn't know each other particularly well, sometimes in a caregiving relationship, in a heart-to-heart relationship between two people, it just feels like inner peace. It feels like Shanti. So the name of this new program was Shanti, and now it's in the community. And for 7 years, as I said, we ran this program. It turned out to be the first in the country. Nobody else had done this before. The Cancer Society was doing some volunteer programs, but not based on peer counseling. This was a peer counseling program. People learned skills. This was neighborliness with skills. Used to be called neighborliness. You go back 100 or 200 years, if somebody gets sick down the end of the street or down the end of the road, you come with food and you support the family and you support the person who's hurting. This is that kind of neighborliness with counseling skills. So it worked. In 1980, I ran this from 1974 to 1980. 1980, I started getting strange calls from docs, colleagues at the Cancer Institute, actually at UC, people I knew. There's a new illness. We don't know how it's spread. It's hitting the gay community really hard. We have no treatment. Will you guys support? Send support volunteers. I said, yeah. What are you calling the illness? They said gay cancer. Well, we were a cancer project, so yeah, the answer was yes. Yeah, of course. Didn't take too long to figure out that what was first called gay cancer and then was called GRID and then was called AIDS had hit this city particularly hard. And we had a choice at Shanti. I had a choice. We had a choice collectively. Each one of us who was involved. There were several hundred volunteers at this point. We had a choice. Did we want to continue our original mission, which was a perfectly noble mission to care for people with cancer, or were we willing to change our focus because there was something? And I remember the first time I heard the word, one of my doc friends said, I think it's an epidemic. Now, I don't know if you can imagine what it's like being the other person on the phone when somebody who has a credibility in your world says to you, I think it's an epidemic. Epidemic connotes all sorts of horrible imagery, especially given what they were telling me about the devastating nature of the illness. I had to then make a decision, which was, were we going to switch from cancer to AIDS? And I had to tell several hundred volunteers in a meeting that we were going to do it. And so I'm looking at people like yourselves, many of whom were The age range varied a lot, put it that way. And I told them, if you want to leave, we don't know how this is transmitted, God bless you, go. If this scares you too much and you're not interested in taking on that emotional burden, you have our permission to go. Not that you need it, but nobody left. I thought I was looking out at this large group of people. I thought they didn't leave because nobody wanted to be the first person to jump ship. I thought that in the following weeks I would get phone calls about all these people who were leaving, and the only people who didn't join us in this new mission were people who wanted to stay, and there were only a few actually, who wanted to stay with the old mission of caring for cancer patients, which was, as I said, a perfectly noble thing to do. If I hadn't taken that, and I'm not saying this from an inflated point of view, just from an amazement point of view, if I hadn't taken the original stand at the Cancer Institute 7 years earlier to start this new project, there would have been no Shanti when AIDS hit. Shanti was the first organization in the country to deal with people with AIDS. Virtually everybody who had AIDS in this city had some contact with Shanti in those days. What if we hadn't been there? What would have happened to those folks? Young men, not so young men, who were afflicted with this horrific illness. And so for years and years and years, we have taken care of people with HIV/AIDS. Demographics have changed, the nature of the illness has changed some. Still an awful threat. Still a challenge. We, some years ago, started seeing people with cancer again. So now we're officially, it's changing, but we now see marginalized women with any form of cancer in the city of San Francisco, in addition to anybody with HIV/AIDS. Part of it has to do with who contacts us and asks us if we're interested in a new project, in a new department. And if we can take it on, we do. I should say that we just joined forces and acquired an organization called PAWS. Pets are wonderful support. Somebody gets sick, who takes care of the pet? Who takes care of the dog or cat or whomever, whatever. It's a wonderful, wonderful connection. What is it that allows people to come to the Shanti trainings 4 times a year? So I'm sitting here looking out at, mostly, they look like kids, they look like my grandkids. I mean, here there are people who are about my age. But when I go to a Shanti training 4 times a year, I'm looking out at 20-somethings who are volunteering to do essentially very difficult work, challenging work. Work you have to do well, for no pay, for as long as you care to do it, but hopefully you'll stay with your client for as long as he or she needs you. And they come. Why do they come? Why do they come? They should be partying. They live in San Francisco. They're kids. Why do they come to Shanti? Because the need to care is as powerful a human need as the need for care. Empathy. The need to care is as powerful a human need as the need for care. So it's been 42 years of learning and relearning a single lesson, the one I mentioned earlier. Love heals. Doesn't always cure. There's a difference between healing and curing. You can heal spiritually. You can heal psychologically, emotionally, interpersonally. Even if you don't get cured. Sounds simple. Love heals. But no less a figure than Albert Einstein made the comment that if you can't say it simply, you don't understand it well enough. Love heals. The rest are details, sometimes important details. 42 years of realizing that the rippling effect of love from one open heart to another is what's motivated 18,000 volunteers over that period of time in this city alone, and 1,100 other organizations around the world who have used the Shanti model of peer support in some fashion, who have learned it. We're not in touch with all of them, but when we were running the Shanti National Training Institute, that's how many people came through, representing that many organizations. So it's not just Shanti in San Francisco. There are organizations with their own names who learned our model and hopefully did it as well or better than we ever did in other places. I spent a good many years traveling around to those organizations trying to help. There are three essential qualities, it seems to me, that lie at the heart of this notion that love heals, this rippling effect of love from one open heart to another. And I learned the three. I had glimpses of them before, but I learned the three while being the primary caregiver to my father, my mother, and my best friend. My father was diagnosed with liver cancer, a very deadly disease. I don't recommend it. In 1990, late 1990. I was in my 40s at the time. I was writing books on high achievers, books on peak performance. And I was at the achievement part of my career. I was pushing, working, visiting groups in this country mostly, but overseas somewhat, trying to help understand both what I was writing about and also understand Shanti. And now my dad's sick, and I was going to help. If you ever had this feeling about somebody you love a lot, I was going to do whatever I could possibly do to help him with this illness. And by help, I meant cure. The doc said it's a terminal illness. But I had read a book called Love, Medicine, and Miracles by a surgeon named Bernie Siegel. And he was studying exceptional patients, people who had terminal diagnoses but didn't die. I knew from the AIDS experience that there were people who contracted HIV early and are still here. They told me originally it was terminal, but I knew people who didn't die. So I knew that this was possible. And Bernie Siegel had videotapes of exceptional patients talking about how they survived. So I got the videotapes from my dad, and we were going to watch them, and he was going to learn how to survive. And I was just motivated to the hilt. And we sat in recliner chairs looking at his television, and I popped in the video cassette. You can appreciate how long ago this was. And up come the exceptional patients talking about how they survived. And I'm riveted. And I look over and I hear something that sounds like snoring. He's out cold. I woke him up. I thought maybe it was the medication he was taking for the pain. So I said, Dad, this is real important. You've got to stay awake for this. I popped it in again. Same thing happened. Then it happened a third time. And I said, Dad, what is going on here? I mean, this is life and death. I'm trying to help you survive. And it was really quiet for a while. And he didn't say anything. It was late afternoon in his house, and I could see the light playing on the walls, the sunlight playing on the walls. Finally, he looked at me. He said, Charlie, that's not me at all. That fight for your life stuff, that's not me at all. My doc said that I only have a limited amount of time. I don't want to waste it trying to do something that's not going to happen. And then he stopped. He paused for a while. And he made eye contact with me in a way that he never did. He was this soft, sweet man who was not very assertive and not very strong, at least in traditional sense. And he looked at me and said, Charlie, I love you. Nobody in my life, before or since, has ever said I love you to me in as authentic a way as that man did at that moment. And something clicked for me. that it would have been an outrage to attempt to force that man to fight for his life, when in fact what he wanted to do was spend his time loving the people he cared about the most. Love heals. Love heals. Our relationship shifted, it changed. My respect for him went through the roof. His connection to my mother and my brother changed. Love heals. Now the second characteristic is a tolerance for not knowing. A tolerance for not knowing. A comfort with not knowing. I learned that from my mother as she was dying from congestive heart failure. I was her primary caregiver. She was rough stuff. If you can think of the person with whom you had the most challenging relationship in your life, if there is such a person, might be a parent, might be a sibling, might be a lover, might be whomever. Well, my mother was rough stuff. She was just as tough as my father was easy. She said to me, "I'm scared." I said, "What are you scared about?" She said, "I don't know where I'm going. I know I'm dying, but I don't know where I'm going." And then she paused and looked at me and she said, "You're in the business, aren't you?" You got to know the lady. Where am I going? She's asking me a question that people have pondered for millennia. I'm supposed to have an answer. I said, I don't know. Where do you think you're going? I asked her the typical shrink question. I was clearly desperate for responses. And she said, I don't know. Well, one day, my partner was there, my wife, and Mom said the same thing. I'm scared and I don't know where I'm going. And so Cindy decided to say to her, it was a stroke of genius, she said, well, there are different traditions that have different stories about dying in the afterlife. Would you like to hear some of them? And my mother, who called herself the perpetual university bum, a student without end, said, yeah, let's read these stories. So tell me those stories. The one story that resonated, so they went through a bunch of stories. The one story that my mother resonated to was a Hindu story about the wave and the drop. That we come into the world as part of a wave. We drop off as of individual identities for a time, and then we fall back into the wave again. Well, the next time I went to visit my mother, she was just very excited. She told me the story of the wave and the drop. She said, this really works for me. A tolerance with not knowing. A tolerance for not knowing. The third, if love heals and a tolerance for not knowing are the first two, the third is a desire to bear witness. Bearing witness is enough. You are enough. You are enough. Not what you do or even who you are, but your compassionate presence is enough. So many people in facing serious illness, somebody with serious illness, want to do something. They want to fix it. They want to change it. They want to make something dramatic happen. When in fact, the most powerful thing you can do is to be there. It's about being, not doing. I learned that from my best friend, somebody I was very close to for years, who I went through graduate school together with, workout partner at the gym and best friend, Rico. Rico was dying of multiple myeloma in his 50s, much too young. And I was with him on a Thursday. He died on a Saturday. And he was in that place that people who are in end-stage disease sometimes get to, or close their eyes and they drift off. And then sometimes they'll open their eyes and blink like babies in a maternity ward and wonder if they're still there. when my mother went through that, to backtrack a little, you know what her comment was when she discovered she was still here? She'd say, "Damn it, I'm still alive." I always thought that when people closed their eyes at the end and they went deeply into themselves, it was like deep sea diving. They sometimes come up with pearls. Not always. Sometimes they just come back and, "Where were you?" "Oh, nowhere. Just thinking." "About what?" "I don't know." Eyes closed, back down again. At one point, Rico came back, blinked his eyes. This is a world-renowned Freudian psychoanalyst. 2 days before his death, comes back, looks at me and says, "Relationships, it's all about relationships." If you know anything about the Freudians, their basic position, the classical Freudians all think that the problem is in the head of an individual, and you have to analyze that. He comes back 2 days before dying and realizes that the key awareness that he didn't have as centrally as he might have it was all about relationships. What did I do? I held his hand and I just said, "Yeah, I think you're right. It's all about relationships." Bearing witness. I didn't do anything. I was just sitting there holding his hand. Bearing witness. Bearing witness is enough. Well, if love heals is one elevator version of everything I've said, there's another one that I seem to say at pretty much every talk I give. I talk fairly often and have a chance to use this quote from James Baldwin, a great writer who should not be forgotten. "The moment we cease to hold each other, the moment we break faith with one another, the sea engulfs us and the light goes out." The moment we cease to hold each other, the moment we break faith with one another, the sea engulfs us and the light goes out. So how do we prevent the light, the rippling effect of love, from going out? Well, the Buddha had a wonderful response. I don't know if the story is apocryphal, but it's certainly told often enough. When the Buddha was dying, all the disciples were just distraught beyond belief. And Ananda, his primary disciple, asked for a final lesson. What is the final lesson? Can you give us one more, Master? One more lesson? And the Buddha is reported to have said, "Make yourself a light. Make yourself a light." How do you make yourself a light? How? By finding a calling that moves you to express the rippling effect of your love in response to another's suffering. Make yourself a light. 18,000 volunteers in the city of San Francisco over 42 years have made themselves a light. Countless tens of thousands of others in 1,100 other organizations. God knows how many. There are organizations that contact us from time to time we never even heard of, who used our model, and they'll say, "Oh, well, I heard him speak, or I read an article about you guys, or I read the training manual, or something." Made themselves a light. They chose to do that because the need to care is as powerful a human need as the need for care. Now, a last question that has no right to go away. Will we wake up in time, you and I, to address the suffering that faces us daily? Will we wake up in time to make ourselves alive? Will we wake up in time, you and I? Christopher Fry, in a poem called The Sleep of Prisoners, says, "The human heart can go to the lengths of God. Dark and cold we may be, but this is no winter now. The frozen misery of centuries breaks, cracks, begins to move. The thunder is the thunder of the flows, the thaw, the flood, The upstart spring, thank God our time is now, when wrong comes up to face us till we take the longest stride of soul men and women ever took. Affairs are now soul size. Affairs are now soul size. The enterprise is exploration into God. Where are you making for? It takes so many thousand years to wake. But will you wake for pity's sake? But will we wake, you and I, for pity's sake, and make ourselves a light? Okay, we have some time. Thoughts, questions? Yes, please.
Yeah, I just want to thank you so much for coming, joining with us this morning.
My pleasure.
And I just want to share my gratitude for all your service over these years as a gay man, living in San Francisco and LA for 70 years, and being here at the beginning of Shanti as a client and as a volunteer. I just want to share gratitude for your wisdom, your insight, your compassion, your action, and your love. That I've seen the miracles through Shanti in both cities and overseas too, and just amazing the miracles and the lives that were healed spiritually and in so many ways. So just want to share my gratitude.
Thank you for that. You made my day. A regular person, okay? I'm no special person. I know that. The people who know me know that. I took a chance on an idea. It was the right idea. But it's not like Einstein and the theory of relativity. It's nothing like that. We could do it, you and I. And it's just as miraculous that any one of those volunteers like yourself did the work that they did with whomever their clients were. That's just as big a miracle. Yes, please.
I'm one of those volunteers from the mid-'80s, and I'm also a physician. So the training was particularly difficult for me because I felt, I was doing something. And finally I got it. Well, you just listen. You sit there and listen. So my first client I get was a patient in the hospital up there in Kaiser. And I'm all ready to go in and listen. I sit down at the bed, bounce myself, and so forth. This guy lying there in the bed. He doesn't say a word. He's awake. He looks at me, and he closes his eyes again. And he continues not to say a word. I attempted once or twice to say something, and then I'll just sit here until he says something. We never did say anything. Well, that was my challenge.
Well, it is a challenge because we want to have the feeling that our presence matters. But the person in the bed is dealing with all manner of challenges that we can't even articulate. Imagine what he was going through while you were sitting there being somewhat self-conscious and uncomfortable and nothing's going on and I want to be helpful. And he's not even acknowledging my presence or saying a thing. But imagine what he's going through, just trying to keep it together in whatever way. And imagine that perhaps he just heard some terribly bad news, or that he's thinking about the illness and his limited time on earth, and all the things that are pressing for him. Sometimes our being there is a gift that's obvious, because the other person says, thank God you're here, will you come back? And sometimes our gift is not at all obvious. We don't know that we made any difference at all. We don't know whether our presence mattered at all. That's part of what it takes to be a volunteer. Yes, please.
Thank you for your talk. I was a volunteer at the Whitman Walker Clinic in Washington, D.C., which I assume you probably had some part in helping establish. And so thank you for all that work. And I just appreciate the question, or the way you framed it, where it's like, what suffering is so intense that you can't not do something. So I was at Against the Stream Dharma Punks this past Friday night, and there was a teacher who was a nun, and she works with in India with like the untouchables, and she's like, it's amazing, like just amazing work. It's similar to IQ. It's like big, to me in my mind, it's giant, enormous work. And so then it makes me think, it makes me feel small and helpless. And because I feel like, in the words of my mother, who sounds a lot like your mother, she used to always say, this whole world's going to hell in a handbasket. And I feel that way. Like there's so much, the world and Dharma's on fire, like it's just, it feels really intense right now. I often get that sensation of like, I can't do anything, or I'm not doing anything, I'm not doing enough. So what I am doing is I'm a kindergarten teacher and a really poor, at a school that serves really poor kids from 10 to 1. So I find a little bit of, I loved your heart to heart. Like I feel like my ripples of love have a direction. And so I feel like your talk just made me, I just want to say like, I'm grateful that your talk made me feel like I am doing something in the light, in the shadow of more giant things like Shanti and this teacher in India, who's got this whole foundation saving women and children.
The world doesn't need you and I to be less than we could be. You're taking care of kindergarten kids? You're teaching kindergarten kids? 5 years old, right? Something like that? Whatever they are nowadays. That's when kids learn the most. That's when they're most receptive. You have this wonderful opportunity, and I bet you're doing it, to influence these developing minds and hearts. The only thing I would question in what you would say is this notion that you're not doing anything or you're not doing enough. Sounds like you're doing some wonderful work. And the world doesn't need us to feel like we're less than. The world needs our best shot. And it seems like you're ideally positioned to give a really wonderful shot to these impressionable, forming minds and hearts. I remember that age vaguely as a distant memory. But you soak up stuff. And here's this nice man who's the teacher, who's in a position to teach these kids invaluable things. Thank you for that.
Sure. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, I'm in line also to thank you very profoundly for your life work. I had the privilege of doing massage and Shanti residences of guys with AIDS, and was actually working with my favorite guy, and we were in a very Shanti-like peaceful place when the earthquake hit, and we were in an old Victorian that literally dissembled around us, and we stayed in this very calm until I saw the chandeliers. But the windows came out, the wall was coming down, the fan. It just was, we were like in a movie, but we were totally in this island of calm. And so thank you for that.
You're very welcome. I never heard that one before.
It was on Pontiac Street.
That's great. Yes, please.
Your talk was a huge booster shot for me. Thank you. As it happens, I'm helping my sister go through this process of dying. She actually was at Shanti in the 80s working as a videographer.
Oh.
But I'm very privileged to have lots of time to be with her, take her to all her appointments. And just hearing what you had to say is helping me a great deal.
I'm glad. I wish you well.
Thank you.
I wish her well.
Just wanted to also thank you personally. You have helped me in a very specific way today with your initial discussion of empathy and putting yourself in the heart of the other person as opposed to trying to fix the problem. That's from an outside perspective, and I have elderly relatives, and aunt and her brother, uncle, he's taken care of. He's 85, she's 97. She needs to be in a nursing home. He had promised her he would never allow her to do that, and he's overwhelmed. She wandered off into the street the other day. She's in holding her in the hospital and about to send her to a nursing home. And from 3,000 miles away, this is all happening in Miami. I have found myself in the last few weeks on the phone trying to fix things to very little avail, of course, because I have very little power in there. But while you've been talking, I've been putting myself in the place of the several players that I've been dealing with, and finding tremendous compassion for all of them. So, I can, to the best that I can be a witness and a help where I can, but it's been tremendously helpful. Just wanted to let you know that in this particular place at this particular time,
Well, thank
your
you.
talk has been great.
Thank you. I wish you well with a challenging situation.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Charlie. I really appreciate your talk. I've never gotten so clearly your point on how important it is to love as much as it is to be loved. As I've told you before, one of my responses to being diagnosed HIV positive was that I'm sort of counterphobic in my need to look at it more closely and to do something about it. And at the time, having the skills in counseling and things was to go and volunteer as a Shanti volunteer. And then, fortunately, I got to work on the AIDS ward at San Francisco General for Shanti. But that was really important to do something meaningful, And it had a dual purpose. It was partly selfish. It helped me as well. But the meaning that I got out of it was tremendous. And I never quite brought that, that it's so important as being loved.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Giving it is as important as receiving it.
yeah. So thank you.
You're welcome. Questions, observations of any kind? Yeah.
Thank you for
You're
the talk. I'm just curious, in terms of empathy, sometimes this culture is characterized as a culture of narcissism, sometimes also antisocial. And those are conditions where there's a lack of empathy. And I'm just curious whether you've seen an evolution. Does it seem to you like empathy, there's more of a deficit of empathy now than there used to be? Or?
It's a wonderful question. It's something I think about. I think that we're more likely to focus on the lack of empathy. Read the newspaper. You read articles about horrible things that happen, one-on-one horrible things, mass horrible things. They don't cover empathic responses. We don't cover those. So Shanti won't get the same coverage as some horrible event that happened where somebody kills a bunch of people or one person. I think that we're in a time when you give me a wonderful entry point to an issue. We're at a time in which We're likely to live long enough, you and I, to see the increasing effects of changes in the world like climate change that are going to challenge our capacity for empathy in ways that we've rarely, if ever, been challenged before. And what I hope is that the better angels of our nature, to use Abraham Lincoln's evocative phrase, the better angels of our nature surface during these challenging times as much as the barbarism that is also likely to surface during very challenging times. The question, which one seems most obvious as you look at the world right now, I would say there's ample evidence for both. You know, there's horrible narcissism and selfishness. And then there's Shanti and all sorts of other examples besides Shanti of organizations and people doing empathic, marvelous things. I think humans are capable of both. Yes, please.
I read an interview with the Dalai Lama a while back where he commented at one point in that interview that he thought that the fact that over half of our marriages and partnerships are failing is because of lack of empathy. We know how to fall in love, and that's one love. Is one kind of love, probably based on craving, imagination, and we don't know how to do the other kind of love, which is empathy. It's understanding when, once we get to know a partner or a person or a friend, that we see their suffering and we don't always know how to relate to that.
I think that that's a wonderful observation. I also think that if you define a relationship as successful only if it's till death do you part, you may be missing an opportunity to see relationships that had a kind of predictable organic trajectory. In other words, a birth, an ascendancy, a peak, a decline, and an end. Relationships die like all organic entities die. And sometimes they die when the participants physically die, but sometimes they die earlier, and that, in my mind, doesn't make them failed relationships. Your point about a lack of empathy, what is the other person experiencing, is well taken. I mean, that people ask about long-term relationships. Do I have an observation about any characteristic that most strikes me about long-term relationships in which the participants both seem happy? And the one response, I remember saying this decades ago, and it just seems true. Each of them is rooting for the other person's well-being as powerfully and sometimes more powerfully than they're rooting for their own well-being. They're rooting for the other person as a kind of deeply felt empathic resonance with the well-being of the other person, with the needs of the other person, with the desires. And when the other person is happy, you get happy. You can feel your own glee. And when the other person is sad, you feel some of that too. I don't mean you take it on as your own burden and you're the cause of it. Nothing like that. Just you're rooting in a very deeply felt way for the well-being of the other. What else? We could talk about Buddhism.
I think you made us all think, and that I know that I will be carrying with me. I will be thinking about this and hopefully putting some of what I learned into action.
I bet you, thank you for that. I bet you that most have already done that. One last point. I've had a number of changes in direction in my work. You heard that part about the Apollo 11 landing. I used to be a mathematician. So one of the questions that some of my closest friends ask, what are you doing now that's interesting to you? You know, is there anything now? I'm 71 years old. Is there anything now that's calling, that's age specific, that has something to do with the stage of life that you're in? You betcha. The one word that comes to mind that seems most central right now is wisdom. I don't mean that I have a ton of wisdom. I just mean I have some that's come from living this long. Well, why is that important? Because the young ones are going to need it. Because they're facing a future unlike the future that we faced. If I'm right about the effects of climate change and other things, but climate change in particular, if you read any of the articles that are very, very hard to read, you'll see that we're in the very near future looking at some very difficult circumstances. What is the legacy that you might leave? I don't mean that you're going anywhere presently, but what is the legacy that you might leave for the young ones? What would you tell them if somebody who was 25 years old said, "You're a lot older than me, you're as old as my grandparents"? I get this from the Shanti people sometimes. I used to be the father figure, now I'm the grandfather figure. All I did was get old. But they ask different questions than they used to when they saw me as father. You ask different questions of grandfather than you do of father. What have you learned? You've been around so long. What have you learned that I should know? Get clear on what that is. What is the essential wisdom that your time on earth has allowed you? And offer that wisdom as a gift to anybody who you think might benefit. I don't mean go around proselytizing. I just mean in everyday conversations. It'll improve your day. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we have a couple of announcements. First of all, we pass around the Dana poll. Dana meaning what I hear, the Pali word for giving, and that sustains our Sangha and all the work that we do in different areas. And our suggested donation is $10 if you can afford it, or more if you can't too. Do we have a host today? Notice that the tea was going on, at least that we got back to serenade us for a little bit, but yes, at the moment they don't seem
I don't think we do have a host, but I could pass the dog.
Well, there's some cookies out there, I believe, so that we can avail ourselves of that and have tea.
I have another announcement as well. My friend John Martin is a wonderful Buddhist teacher and also the director of the San Francisco Airport, is offering a day-long, kind of in-town day-long retreat at the Vista Stream, which is not very far from here, for the LGBTQ community on loving kindness. So a day-long on loving kindness for the LGBTQI community
And where does that happen?
At Against the Stream. You can look them up online, but I also left there's flyers all over out there that look like this. Just help yourself.
Didn't look up for that. Yeah.
In addition, because of our wonderful Buddhist teacher who's head of the airport, there's also a meditation room at the airport that's separate from the Muslim prayer room. It's a meditation room, and there's also a yoga with yoga equipment in between flights. So that's a good ripple effect. As well, I want to remind everybody that Spirit Rock in mid-June is having the gay retreat. It's either 4 or 5 nights, and there's still spaces available, and they're on a sliding scale. It's wonderful scholarships and a beautiful place to spend 4 or 5 nights with 2 wonderful teachers, Anushka and our friend from Montreal, Pascal, are the 2 teachers, so give them a call.
If you see John Martin, say hello for me. He used to be on the board at Shanti.
Will do.
And our next speaker next week will be Heather Sundberg. She's a friend of the Sankar. She's been here many times, so that will be next week. I'm not sure when the carnival is happening. Does anybody know? Would that be? Is that happening next week or the week after?
I think it's the weekend of Memorial Day.
Okay. So that will be next. That would be the 2 weeks. 2 weeks. No, I just wanted to give a heads up to people because normally that becomes really difficult. They close up several streets nearby, and it might be difficult to get to here. So at least allow yourself extra time. Alrighty, with that in mind, this is time then now for our dedication of merit. Should know by heart now, but it's always good to have it in front of me. Yeah. By the power and truth of this practice, may all beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all be free from sorrow and the causes of sorrow. May all never be separated from the sacred happiness which is without sorrow, and may all live in equanimity without too much attachment or too much aversion, believing in the equality of all that lives.
Thank you for listening to the Gay Buddhist Forum. If you would like to hear several new talks per month and be notified of upcoming speakers so you can participate live, please subscribe to this podcast, like us on Facebook, and join our mailing list by visiting gaybuddhist.org.